Richard, thanks very much for that. I gather that I didn't hear exactly what you were saying, but I gather the camera's on me and performance starts. You can read the biogs of Bob and Simon on our website. I'm anxious to cut to the chase. President Biden has been issuing all these executive orders. So the first question is to Simon. The Biden presidency should signal the end of Trumpism, but we've yet to see what happens with the impeachment vote through the Senate to see whether former President Trump is convicted. What does Trumpism and its survival mean for Australia? Because we're so dependent on what happens in American politics.
Indeed. Let me just say quickly, in the interest of time, thank you for the opportunity to participate in this forum and that play on the list of previous speakers. To be in that group, a great honour. But look, this week indeed shows that Trump, unlike a lot of US presidents that lose office after one term, typically that's consignment to the history books, but not for Donald Trump. And indeed, it's not just about impeachment this week, but he leaves office with a hold over his political party that we haven't seen for a losing one-term president in the American system. Jimmy Carter did not have this hold over the Democrats when he loses to Reagan in 1980, Herbert Hoover over the Republicans in 1932. And it poses a great dilemma because Republicans typically have been the party of that responsible Pax Americana, the liberal rules-based international order. Republican legislators have been at the helm of that. And that bipartisan commitment to that is under as much seen it. I think in the long run, though, or not even in the long run, Quentin, I think there's one word that I think perhaps pushes the isolationist tendencies of Trump to one side, and that word is China. If there's one thing that Democrats and Republicans, even in the age of Trump, or we're transitioning to perhaps of some form of post-Trump age, there is still nonetheless, I think, a dogged determination to confront what I think on both sides of American politics is regarded as the single biggest foreign policy challenge of their age, of our age, and that is the China challenge to American primacy. And while that remains the animating problem for American foreign policy, Australia will be a highly regarded ally, and Australia will be extremely valuable to the United States as well. Now that poses some challenges that I think we'll get into perhaps a little bit later on. I'm mindful we've got Bob perhaps to weigh in on this as well, but I think I'd leave it at that for now, Quentin.
Thanks, Simon. Bob, the end of Trumpism?
No, not at all. I've never seen a Bonapartist figure like this in American politics, least of all in the Republican Party. The leader, Trump, is bigger than the party. Large sections of the party are still wedded to this man. And this is extraordinary, it's unprecedented. And it means that all he represents, white nationalism, an unsavoury alliance with militia, QAnon, conspiratorial extremists who are poisoning the fringes of his party, and which many party Republican leaders at the state level are very hesitant to break with. Witness Michigan, for example. This will continue to be an intrusion into American politics. Right now, you've got to say a Trump candidate, him, a son or a daughter, is sitting favoured to win the Republican nomination, and that Trump candidates are going to be very eager to challenge those relatively lonely Republicans who voted against Trump in Congress in the last 2 weeks. They'll be challenged in their primaries. Liz Cheney, for example, and the others. This is an extraordinary phenomenon, and I think, and I'll conclude with this sentence, I think it should make us all think that among the threats to democracy is the possibility of a great Western political party being poisoned from the inside.
Thank you. Simon, I think President Biden has got a summit of the world's democracies coming up on climate change and also disinformation through social media, which is a phenomenon in the West now. We'll get to China shortly, but it's in the context of the defence of democracies. Can Biden counter Trumpism? As Bob indicates, it's likely to stay with us for the foreseeable and aggressive future.
I think he's got to try, and I think he is going to try, and he's been very forthright about this. I think embracing, as he has to, the fact that brand America has been just so violently damaged. The question is it irreparably damaged? But for the Biden strategy is that American global leadership starts with getting its own democratic house in order at home. There is this summit of democracies. I think that'll be very significant. We'll see what comes of it, though. But I'd also point to the first bill that the House of Representatives took up in this new Congress, H.R. 1 in the American numbering system, is a sweeping piece of legislation designed to shore up American electoral institutions, offering some carrots and sticks, the sticks being electoral security to try and get Republicans on board with this, the carrots being ease and uniformity in mail access to vote by mail. But I think Biden recognizes that the American case for leadership of the global democratic world, and indeed standing up to China, as it were, in this sort of powerless moment as well, you cannot do that credibly until you've put some runs on the board with writing the case and the perception of American democracy. And that begins with some hard work at home. All this talk, though, Quentin, about can Biden unify the country? I get asked that so often. Well, it takes two to tango, right? You can't compel Republicans to unify with the Democrats in a free country. And so I think we're in for a very rough ride in the United States, while, as Bob sort of eloquently pointed out, Trump has this hold over his party, and the next election is never too far away. But I think Biden, again, thinking about this from Australia's interests, much turns on America's ability to notch some wins for that case for being, as it was for much of the post-war period, the leader of the world's democracies.
Bob, Biden is trying to get the stimulus package through. We've got to get through the COVID pandemic and its impact, but perhaps just as more importantly is saving the planet, and his executive orders on decarbonising the United States economy and leading with John Kerry the world debate. Can he do it? He's got to take the world with him.
Yes, but the world is moving with him. This is a very impressive manifestation of American leadership. Just tick it off. Politically, it unites the Democratic Party. Chuck Schumer, considering the possibility of a primary challenge in New York right now, is demonstrating that he's as strong as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez on climate. This unites all sections of the Democratic Party, with the just possible arguable exception of a certain senator from West Virginia. But it is the most unambiguous statement about American leadership that has been made by the new president. He's put climate, as he says, at the heart of American diplomacy. He's rallying American allies around climate. His commitments, enforced by executive orders, I don't think could be stronger. All coal, all gas out of the electricity network by 2035. He has said to every one of his departments and agencies, identify any subsidy you're giving to carbon and remove it from your next year's budget bid, unambiguous to his public sector chiefs. When he's pivoted by reintroducing the Obama-era standards on vehicles, American vehicles, he's found this time round that the American vehicle industry is ready not to resist, but to deliver for him. Now, this is very exciting. I think John Kerry, who is his envoy, is ready to hit the corporate sector. Will have implications for Australia with the appointment of a major finance figure to see that all those companies that have virtuously made signals about 2050 must start delivering in the 2020s. And he could be moved, this is where he's powerful, because he's moving in tandem with the UK and Europe, and I'll come to something else in a moment, with China. The UK is identifying with a key concept here, and that is an annual vote for shareholders on the climate plans of their companies. Now, that's a big step, but if it takes off as a European and American standard, we will be asked to measure up. Japan committed to net zero emissions by 2050 because the international finance sector has told Japan that it must, the Norwegian Wealth Fund and BlackRock in America. I believe there are some still opaque but potentially encouraging signs coming out of China. Next month's 14th five-year plan must deliver on the promise of Xi Jinping to deliver net zero emissions by 2060. And it must do that in the form of cancelling plans adopted as economic stimulus measures early last year for new coal-fired power. If they're junked and the Chinese deliver on what's beginning to appear in the Chinese media as commitments to the most energetic reshaping of their energy policy, and the biggest development, this is out of the Chinese media, the biggest development since the very beginnings of, quote, reform and opening up, unquote, then things are very exciting and promising for the planet indeed. I think, and I'll conclude with this, I think that President Biden and his special envoy Kerry will immediately move to put pressure on China to decarbonise the Belt and Road Initiative, but they could be surprised that they're pushing on an open door. I was very interested in a statement attributed to the head of the Beijing-based Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank that they're ready to move in that direction. So this is global leadership. It is a complete vindication of the Biden claim to use power. I've not seen a Democrat president. Not Carter, not Clinton, not even cool-headed Admirable Obama, begin a presidency with such sure-footedness. Things are going to get tougher and the Republican opposition will be colossal. But this is a very agile start, and especially on climate, the issue you asked me about.
Simon, Scott Morrison, our Prime Minister, has had his phone conversation with Joe Biden. They've talked about climate change. We'll get to trade and China shortly, but on climate change, is Australia now looking like a pariah?
I actually don't think so. I think if the executive orders, and particularly the directions to government agencies that Bob was referring to, are really far-reaching. If Australia ends up looking like a pariah, it won't be because John Kerry is shining a big bright light or putting us under pressure. I think it'll be the Australian people, frankly, will figure out just how far the United States might be going, particularly if a grand bargain is struck of some sort with China on this, or, as I think is perhaps a little more likely, the Biden administration sees competition with China on green technologies and a race to decarbonisation as being one of the markers of global leadership through the mid-century. I think the Australian people's witness of that, bearing witness to that, that'll be the mechanism through which I think pressure is applied, or the blowtorch of global public opinion is applied to Australian policy settings. It's hard for me to imagine an ally like the United States, publicly at least, putting the government of a close ally like Australia under sort of maximum pressure, as it were, on this issue. I think there are plenty other channels, and some of them are straight out commercial, by the way. You don't need public opinion, I think, for some of the same reasons Bob was referring to about what's going on in American corporate life. I think you'll find some of the same decisions being made in Australian corporate life as well. So it'll be those mechanisms, I think, that reveal to Australia where we are in the global pecking order on this thing, rather than a sort of a lecture from former Secretary of State John Kerry.
Yeah, Bob, it won't be, Quentin, if I can say this in response to Simon, I don't think there'll be any lecturing or hectoring or bullying. American courtesy and courtesy towards an ally would intervene at any suggestion of that. But I agree with Simon. I think there'll be enormous corporate pressure. Any Australian boardroom, for example, has got to take account of what the US president is saying. This is setting a world climate. America, under Biden, has withdrawn international financing for carbon-related activity. If you're in Origin Energy and you've got American gas partners, you know that those American gas partners are now not able to have access to the subsidies they previously had. So it's implicit pressure. Biden's convening the April 22 summit. He's holding the summit for one reason: to extract bigger concessions on climate from the participants. And Australia's got to turn up. The pressure is implicit. We've got to turn up. We've got to say something. It's untenable for Australia to continue to be a laggard on climate, faced with the responsibility of saying something, and saying something serious at such a summit, knowing that down the track there's an obligation to do the same at Glasgow. And don't forget the severe embarrassment Morrison suffered in respect of our relationship with Downing Street, when in December he was dropped from a speaking slot. The pressure is there, and yes, it will be polite, but it's the pressure. 90% of it is turning up, as Bill Clinton used to say, and the obligation to turn up is huge pressure.
Bob, domestically, Australian politics in the context of the Biden presidency, where does this leave your once great party? I mean, courage attracts, lack of courage repels.
Any generalisation is going to fall short of the sheer brazenness of your question. I think I'd answer in these terms. I think the centre-left around the world, challenged in so many ways by the changes in society, is hugely heartened by what this presidency promises. The action on climate change is just breathtakingly reminiscent of Roosevelt's 100 Days.
Yeah.
And as I said earlier, such a big contrast with the stumbling or the excessive caution, the lack of clear-headedness of some other democratic presidents making their tentative start. I think it's a shot in the arm for all of those with a centre-left Democrat leadership council sort of agenda.
Thanks. Simon, let's talk about China. Biden's new Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, is a noted hardliner on China. What does that signify for peace in the region? Because at the moment there's a great tension over the Taiwan Straits, and there's some commentators, some analysts, strategic defence analysts, are starting to talk of China versus the United States. In fact, war.
Well, just on Blinken, I think to call him a hardliner, Quentin, I don't think I'd quite go that far. If we reserve the moniker hardliner, say, for his successor, Pompeo, I think there's some subtle differentiation. I think the mindset is the same, and that'll go down in the books as one of the enduring legacies of the Trump administration. I think to bring out into the open sort of anxiety about China has now become a widespread bipartisan embrace that the United States is in an era of competition with China. I think where Blinken might depart from Pompeo, though, is the modus operandi, and that is, one, to put allies front and center in whatever it is you're going to do with respect to China, that America first is not going to get it done with whatever the strategic end state you might have in mind, number one. And number two, it's more competition, less confrontation with China. And indeed, you parse some of the speeches of Biden and Blinken carefully, it takes us back to domestic policy as well. I mentioned earlier about getting democracy's house in order in the United States. But I'd also go back to my earlier answer about climate change. That is going to become one of the battlefields, as it were, the competition for hearts and minds, and also for technological and commercial superiority here is going to take place for renewable technologies and who's first to market and is bringing their population and hence the world along with them. I think for so much of the Biden administration's mindset, it's linking some of the things they want to do domestically to actually advance foreign policy aims that include, I think, shoring up American primacy for a few decades longer than I think some forecasters had seen it going. But Quentin, to get back to Taiwan, look, that is obviously, I think, the flashpoint that every analyst is looking at. I think if you were to do a poll around, privately, people would go off the record around Canberra, around Washington. Everybody, of course, thinks that, is Xi thinking this is his moment to act? The assessments are actually pretty dire, Quentin. In a conventional state-on-state conflict, there many wargaming scenarios seeing at best the 50-50 position that the United States and allies could actually successfully turn back a dedicated Chinese military assault to take Taiwan, to blockade Taiwan, whatever the scenario is. It's a really tough question. What would Australia do in that, and what could Australia do in the event of a contingency in the Taiwan Strait? There's one scenario, Quentin, where I think, and this is the scenario people sort of that really worries a lot of people, it'd be all over so quickly that before Australia and the United States could really sort of mount some sort of campaign, but perhaps with Japan supporting the operation in some way. It'd be a sort of what people refer to as a fait accompli operation. And I think that's what this show of force that the Biden administration has been up to, just in the opening weeks of the presidency, lots of demonstrations of presence, as it were, not just in the South China Sea, but putting the John S. McCain through the Taiwan Strait just last week. These are real sort of wagging of the finger back to Beijing. Don't test us now, and that there will be heavy costs to pay if you were to misjudge this being your moment, China, with respect to Taiwan. But it is clearly, I think, the arena that promotes the most, not just strategic concern, but I think near-term tactical operational heartache as well.
Bob, do you agree with that analysis?
Yeah, basically, I think it was to be expected that the new administration would have to send strong signals on China. Otherwise, Southeast Asia, apart from Japan, apart from other observers, would draw the conclusion that there was a return to Obama approaches to the advent of Chinese power. Kurt Campbell and Jake Sullivan had co-authored an article in Foreign Affairs. If I'm not mistaken, it was about China-US relations in the last couple of years, one of several by Kurt Campbell. And if I'm not mistaken, it had the heading "Competition Without Catastrophe." Competition without catastrophe. And clearly the new American administration, reflecting the consensus in the Congress, will, on intellectual property, on the tech wars, on various other economic measures, pursue a more explicit competition with China and maintain the patrols in the South China Sea. I would hope that the seasoned hand Kurt Campbell plays and a capacity to understand Chinese interlocutors would lead to some very precise management of the bundle of issues around the status of Taiwan. In the interest of peace, we've got to gravitate back to the polite fictions that are the diplomatic position, the well understood diplomatic fiction on Taiwan, because to contemplate those nightmare scenarios, and it fills you with horror to hear to read someone talking about a 50% chance of war over Taiwan. And it raises the question, I think a question Hugh White has asked, what does victory over China look like? What does victory, when John Mearsheimer talks about America's record at dispelling any challenges to its primacy, he instances Japan, Imperial Germany, Nazi Germany. I mean, what are we talking about here? What does victory over China look like? No one's answered that question for me. Does it mean American occupying troops engaging with roadside bombs in Shandong province with its population of 100 million? No one's defined that. And I think an excessive American focus on the DLP words, dominance, leadership, primacy, is rather unhealthy. And it's interesting that more sophisticated American thinkers, Kurt Campbell's one of them, has been able to look at this whole question, this whole field of US-China competition, sometimes at least, without becoming over-focused on primacy. I mean, where do you settle if your focus is we are defending not a world order, not systems of world governance, but we're defending the concept of primacy. That's open-ended. And America's got to consider that the Europeans made clear during the lame duck period that they were focused on an investment deal with China. And if the EU's doing that, I don't think the UK will be far behind. France and Germany, very focused on car exports. Their interests aren't perfectly aligned on China with those defined by Secretary of State Blinken. Southeast Asia, the 10 nations of Southeast Asia, not excluding Vietnam, have got far more nuanced and cautious approaches towards China, which they see, including the Singaporeans, as being just over the horizon. They want America to stay in the region, but they don't want to be forced to choose. They've been used to dealing with China for thousands of years, as one former Singaporean foreign minister puts it. Don't forget that Japan has got a working relationship with China and about 2,000 years of experience in confronting Chinese civilization and matching it against its own. Australia's won plaudits in Washington, and we've just about sacrificed a bilateral relationship with China to do it. But our position is relatively lonely, although it's encouraged by America in this phase. The thing that's got to worry about us is how America handles trade, because I think that's an open-ended question.
We'll get to that shortly, but Simon, polite fictions is understood in diplomacy, but there's diminishing polite fictions on the plight of the people of Hong Kong, the pro-democracy movement and its crushing on one country, two systems, and the plight of the Uyghurs. The reason I said Blinken looked to be hardline on China is he said that he agreed with Pompeo that the Uyghur plight was, by definition, genocide.
Well, if that's hardliner, then big chunks of the United States are hardliners then. There's very few voices, and indeed it's one of the great unifying factors in the American mindset towards China right now. There's something for everybody to not like about China at the moment, all the way through from the left, the AOC squad inside the Democratic caucus. You've got human rights concerns there, through IP, through to more, tugging at the strings of American nationalism and, the primacy word or even the dominance word. But right now, China has been doing a terrific job of solidifying not just American public opinion and elite opinion, perhaps in particular, against it, but perhaps also around the democratic world. And perhaps there's just enough unease there to have people are willing to put aside other differences and understand that their relationship with China is sort of complicated and subtle. And indeed, Australia's in that same boat. We have a different relationship with China than the United States does, but there's enough pushing in the same direction. Some of the examples you mentioned, Quentin, are exhibits A, B, and C on that. That is creating a sort of a unity of vision and increasingly a unity of purpose around the Indo-Pacific in particular. And increasingly in Europe. Everything, as I said, from IP through the human rights issues, it makes, I think, it a little bit easier for hawks to merge with doves when it comes to China policy. So look, that's I don't see that going away. It's very tough, I think, right now for Xi to change policy settings on any of those things. That would, I think, be tantamount to be saying to giving to pressure from the West. And so I think we are where we are for the foreseeable future. I'd be curious to hear Bob's views on this issue.
Yes, Bob.
Yeah, I think China's got to live with the choices it made very consciously, very deliberately, about the level of repression in Xinjiang province. The party faced a spectrum of possible responses to the existence of separatist elements and some with a demonstrated terrorist tendency. It's clearly chosen the most repressive on that spectrum of available responses, and the world, the Western world, is paying close attention. And China's got to live with that. It will be on the list of talking points for every European foreign minister engaging with Wang Yi, his or her Chinese counterpart. The only qualification, and I just notice because of my interest in Southeast Asia, is how little engaged with it are the Islamic nations of Indonesia, Pakistan, and Malaysia. I mean, it is quite striking. And China's position in the Middle East hasn't been deflected by what's happening in Xinjiang. But China's made a decision to enforce a level of dominance, Han dominance in Xinjiang, and that will figure big in perceptions of China, especially from the Western world. The same with Hong Kong, which is very significant for Western observers. China did have the option of continuing to rule one step removed, but opted to eliminate what was so attractive about Hong Kong, and that was the existence of an identifiable, proudly held different system. And the Hong Kong legal system was a great embellishment, and it created the possibility that Hong Kong, so often in the last 100 years, would provide a model to China as it did to Sun Yat-sen, of a modern, effective, well-governed city-state.
If we do get a summit of, we are going to get a summit of the democracies, is this, particularly after Trumpism, as we've been discussing, that the world's democracies could come together and present a consensus against authoritarianism and get President Xi to reconsider geopolitically about how he and China engages with the world? Simon?
Look, I'm not optimistic that that's going to change President Xi's mind, especially what I am a little focused on is some of our Southeast Asian neighbours aren't exactly models of democracy themselves. and that a return to global leadership by the United States, but that puts the D word, not dominance, but democracy front and center. Well, that works for Australia, and it'll work for Japan, and it works for a lot of places. But it's interesting, frankly, when it comes to what is one of the great fulcrums in the world right now, and that's Southeast Asia. Huge focus there as there is strategic significance, but the first card out of the deck being an embrace of democracy. This is a live debate right now with between a number of our scholars here and counterparts in the US and Australian equities here. We're much closer geographically, for one thing, to some of those less than fully democratic Southeast Asian nations, and how Australia's national interests may or may not be implicated by a full-throated American embrace of putting democracy front and center in this convening in this way. It's presenting its credentials as the world's preeminent nation again.
I'd be very careful about it if I were in Washington. By the way, there are two countries when I was foreign minister that sponsored conferences on democracy. One was Mongolia. It's an absurdly out of the way point to make, but Mongolia did manage a transition out of a communist one-party state, a Marxist-Leninist political system, into quite a vibrant, competitive democracy that's seen government alternate. And Indonesia as well, with a very proud claim, had an annual conference in Bali devoted to the great theme of democracy. But it is hard to sow the seed of democracy. A great Indonesian leader, SBY, gave advice to the Burmese military, said to the Burmese military, take it from me, Indonesia's done this. The role of the military is back in the barracks. Now, it was a tremendous thing for an Indonesian leader to be able to serve that up to the military strongmen in Burma, who are in the process of ceding freedom to their people in an exercise that has proven to be tragically short-lived. If I were America, though, I'd think carefully about this. Are they going to exclude Malaysia? And I thought America was about building some strategic cooperation with Vietnam, for example. But Vietnam can't be invited to a forum on the democracies. This is a divisive issue for America if it's trying to gently encourage resistance to the economic appeal of China in Southeast Asia. And I'd simply I'd simply revert in conclusion to my somewhat provocative debating point with Americans. You are not a democracy. America's not a democracy. You don't have an electoral college redistributing the popular vote for president and producing minority presidencies if you're a democracy. And you don't have half your states with voter suppression laws making it harder for the poor and the black to get the vote if you're a democracy. America's proudest boast is freedom of expression entrenched in the Constitution. That's where America stands as a shining light in contrast with those states that are repressing competition for political power and full-throated, blaring, competitive viewpoints. And if I were Americans, I'd look at calling it a freedom of expression or a freedom conference. But you get into democracy, and it's not America's strongest point after the events of the last year.
Thank you, Bob. Simon, let's get back to Australia in the era of Biden. Australia is now seems like we've outmaneuvered ourselves. We've lost or we're being punished on timber, meat, coal, cotton, lobsters, barley, and wine because of our great American friends. One assumes. How can we redeem this situation? How can we get our relationships with China and perhaps the resetting of a Biden presidency could help us do that.
Perhaps, and perhaps it's already started to happen. There's some very strong signals of support from members of the Biden team before they had actually been sworn in, that the economic coercion that Australia was being subject to was unacceptable, and America would always stand in solidarity with Australia on those things. And so is the air starting to perhaps go out of the balloon a little bit, number one. Number two, I just dispute the premise, Quentin. I think it's a mistake to say we're being punished for being close to the Americans. The decisions that Australia took, Australia was ahead of the United States on Huawei, for instance, and 5G. And it was one of the things we at the US Studies Centre heard a lot through the Trump 4 years, was that we were somehow sucking up to the United States with some of the decisions we were taking to try and stay on Trump's good side. I don't think Trump
Are you saying this is unilateral of Australia, that we weren't part of the Five Eyes strategy?
I don't think there was anything. I think we were, in fact, ahead of the other Five Eyes partners on occasion. I don't think the pressure came to us through the Five Eyes network to do anything in particular. Look, I think there were would they like us to do more in the South China Sea? Yes, they would, but I think that we indicated we had some red lines there a long time ago. Was there dismay about the decision around the Port of Darwin? Yes, there was. But there was, I think, also by the same token, great admiration for the 5G decision, which, by the way, followed an earlier decision about the NBN and Huawei's participation in that. I think Australia's actually had a long history of making some of these determinations about things we're comfortable with China doing and things we're not comfortable with China doing in our domestic circumstances, quite independently of the US. Now, sometimes not independently of the US, in concert with, absolutely. But I think this sort of, it's a little bit of a trope that the people making these decisions, advising government in particular, are part of some sort of global sort of cabal. Look, there's a lot of cooperation, but I can point to quite a few instances where we were ahead of the Americans and certainly ahead of the Brits on some of these decisions that seem to have really to the extent one can explicitly connect dots. And I don't think it was Foreign Minister Payne was looking to score brownie points with Trump and Pompeo with that on that's saying it's great to have an international inquiry into the origins of COVID. I don't think that was part of some master plan to stay nice with the Americans. I think the relationship with the US was just fine. Thanks very much. I actually think that was call it what you want, but that wasn't the motivation.
I'd make this point, Simon. I think Simon, from my perspective, is half right. We weren't asked by the Americans. We weren't pressured by the Americans, but we golly damn well made it look like. The failure of Australian diplomacy was we made it look like we were doing it to appease the Americans. Take Huawei, for example. We could have made the decision on Huawei in August 2018 without our Prime Minister leaving the meeting of the National Security Committee, walking down the corridor and ringing President Trump to report it to him, behaving like a schoolboy eager to be patted on the head by his headmaster. Simon, congratulations to Simon for recalling the decision of the Gillard government.
That's right.
Which I, as Foreign Minister, defended publicly, defended with the Chinese against some Chinese protest, and that was to exclude Huawei from providing equipment to the NBN. I just said as Foreign Minister, and Gillard said as Prime Minister, we're doing this because every country is entitled to protect the security and resilience of its national communication system. We didn't say, and Turnbull didn't have to give the impression in August 2018, we're excluding Huawei as a response to American alliance imperatives. But he did give that impression, And there was leaking to the media later that year that suggested we were going to lead Five Eyes in that direction. These were needless gestures. And with COVID-19, why on earth did we have to let the media know in April last year that before we made that Sunday, that ill-prepared Sunday announcement on the insiders that we wanted an inquiry to target China with weapons-style inspectors going into Wuhan, why did we have to let the media know that our Prime Minister had spoken to Donald Trump about this very question? I don't blame the Americans here. I blame inept Australian diplomacy for not being able to achieve diplomatic goals, the security and resilience of our national broadband network, for example, or seeking a full, serious international inquiry into the origins and early management of this wretched pandemic. We could have achieved those goals without making each of them look like flamboyantly pro-American gestures. The fault is not the Americans, it's the ineptitude of Australian diplomacy.
A good point, Bob, but in the context of Biden's presidency, how can Australia reset its trade relationship with China? Some of our industries are hurting. We've got no Chinese students coming. There's no high rollers coming to the casino.
Quentin, we began a tilt in our language about the China relationship in 2017. I've written about this on numerous occasions. I don't believe there is anything. It's got to the point, the way the quest for the COVID-19 inquiry, the origins and early management of it was pitched, was almost, forget China, if the COVID disaster had started in Colombia or Rwanda or the Solomon Islands, we couldn't have gone about pitching our bid for an inquiry in a more antagonistic manner. And I think Australia's got to live with these consequences. My advice to the Chinese, and I put it to a Chinese diplomat, this is behaviour unworthy of the world's rising power. Ignore the provocations from Australia, continue to trade with us because we've got the best wine and the most environmentally imperfect coal, the least imperfect coal. Keep doing business with us, rise above what you see as the provocations, and continue to invest in this bilateral relationship. They haven't done it. I don't think there's anything to be done about it. The one challenge for America is that in its own trade dealings with China, it doesn't pick up the markets like that 1 billion market in Australian wine that has now been lost with Californian vintages. That would be a pretty woeful symbol that we've done things to win plaudits in Washington and America's picked up the markets we've forgone.
Simon?
I'd agree with that, Larsis, and again, it's an issue we're tracking very carefully here at the US Study Centre, that our closest strategic ally, the United States, doesn't see great commercial opportunity from economic coercion being applied to Australia at the moment. I think at a slightly higher level, and this was true under the Trump administration, could well be true under the Biden administration. Is there some deal gets done, irrespective of the short-term commercial opportunities that this current stuff is presenting, but is there some bigger, longer-term deal that gets done bilaterally between the US and China that systematically creates some disadvantage to Australia? Now, we have a free trade agreement with the United States. We have a free trade agreement with China. There are some backstops there, if you will, but I think that's another thing that I think poses some really interesting issues in terms of management of the relationship. That's so close in so many aspects, but the sting that would accompany Australia being kind of worse off from any sort of either near-term, quite venal commercial sort of opportunism from exporters in the United States versus something grander and more strategic that sort of did not give voice to this idea that allies are central to the US approach to China. I think that would be that would be a real pain point in the relationship were that to occur. And I guess that's the other thing that senators like ourselves, we're paying especially close attention to as the Biden administration, eventually gets, are finding their desks, but what policy will actually result down the road.
What rhetorical change, what change in rhetoric could you possibly suggest to Foreign Minister Maurice Payne, just to change the atmosphere?
Well, I run a US Studies Center, so I'm not going to give advice to Maurice on China, but perhaps I'll leave that to Bob, who was a foreign minister himself.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. I just don't know. I just don't know. I'd have to workshop that with our diplomats. You got to a point where you don't want to appear you've responded to pressure. Now, that's out of the diplomatic playbook, isn't it? The diplomatic textbook.
101, yeah.
If you're under pressure, you can't be seen to give in. I think Australia, I think the problem is that Australia has lost a lot of its reputation for diplomatic professionalism. As a middle power, we used to be somewhat creative. We could be at the forefront of solving diplomatic problems. I think our performance in managing the challenges of a China relationship as an American ally with serious alliance obligations, I think our challenge has been woeful. I don't think it is excruciatingly hard. And I think the instincts of a John Howard, a Keating, a Gareth Evans would have seen us through this. I just cannot believe that from 2017, even Tony Abbott was managing the relationship very well. Free trade agreement, the visit by Xi, entering the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, all at the same time, while making all reasonable commitments to the alliance relationship with the US.
Final question from the audience. Bob, to you first. While Biden is in the process of reversing all the wrong policies of Trump, how will Biden continue with the US policy of staunch support for Israel for its violations of Palestinian human rights?
Well, my friends in the pro-Arab lobby in Washington tell me that they've never had better access to a Democratic candidate and his campaign team than they enjoyed with Biden. They've restored aid to the Palestinians and they've allowed the Palestinians back into Washington. The diplomatic challenge, and it is an exquisite one, is how to bolt on to Trump's grandiose diplomatic solution, the Abraham Accords, how to bolt onto that some hope for a Palestinian state living beside Israel in peace and security. And I think it's going to be very hard given the resistance in Israel and given that while Israel hasn't annexed the West Bank, and yes, that's a victory for Trump diplomacy, it's given up on plans to annex the West Bank, but Israel is still spreading these wretched settlements, leaving the Palestinians with a sense of despair. So we're back to a Democrat Secretary of State in the tradition of American Secretaries of State, Democrat and Republican, trying to breathe life into that 30-year-old notion of a two-state solution.
Solution, yeah.
Simon,
one little factoid to. Oh, sorry, Quentin. Go ahead. Yeah.
No, go you.
I was just going to say real quickly. A really interesting data point is that the number of foreign policy advisors that report directly to the president, the so-called National Security Council, there's almost been an inversion between Trump and Biden of the amount of talent, as it were, eyeballs devoted to Middle Eastern issues to Indo-Pacific issues. I think the Biden team, Blinken, the appointment of someone like Kirk Campbell as a sort of a czar for Indo-Pacific matters, I think there's this real dedicated attempt, at least by the Biden administration, to say that our strategic focus lies towards the Pacific and a little less focus than we've had historically on the Middle East. There are less American strategic interests implicated in the Middle East for the foreseeable future than there have been in the past.
Well, we could go on about Middle East all night, but this is about Biden and Australia. I think we've done pretty well. I'm so grateful, Bob Carr and Simon Jackman. Thanks, everybody. Back to you, Ahmed.
Thank you, Quentin. Good evening, distinguished viewers, my newly extended families, uncles, aunties, cousins. First and foremost, I wish you all a very happy new year. I pray this year brings peace and, most importantly, health to everyone around the globe. I look forward to hosting you all in the year 2021 as we have planned many new webinars and events as we continue to walk together on the path of the global peace. I'd like to sincerely thank our inspiring speakers of tonight, my esteemed friends, Bob and Simon. It was a very remarkable, engaging, and eye-opening conversation. Thank you. Uncle Quentin for fantastically facilitating this event, and Uncle Richard for presenting the warm welcoming. After tonight's vivid conversation, it is true to say that, in a sense, democracy is nurtured by the principles and values, including respect for the rule of law for everyone and the independence of the judiciary, accountability for the rulers, and the preservation of undeniable rights and freedoms of every citizen. For a democratic country, a democratic leader is required. Great leaders have various leadership qualities and are able to be leaders not only in one aspect of life, but they can and should lead their community to success in every field. In the words of Martin Luther King Jr., a genuine leader is not a searcher for consensus, but a molder for consensus. I believe and I hope the quality of universal human rights and the rule of law with democracy can be used to every corner of the world to elevate the respect humanity in its true origin and obtain world peace. Having said that, I trust and I believe that Australia has great capacity to influence the world about the spreading of democracy and raising awareness of human rights and the rule of law in the Indo-Pacific region and the world. Finally, I would like to invite you to Affinity's upcoming webinar book launch in partnership with the Institute for Economics and Peace and Sydney Peace Foundation. In his groundbreaking novel, Peace in the Age of Chaos, Steve Kilelia, founder of both the Global Peace Index and the Institution for Economics and Peace, shares his personal journey to measure and understand peace. Tune in to hear veteran ABC broadcaster Uncle John Cleary and Steve Kilelia discuss how positive peace provides an exciting new approach to solving some of the most difficult problems of our time. A 20% discount code can be found on Affinity's social media pages. Thank you once again to our distinguished speakers, Quentin, Bob, Professor Simon, and also Uncle Richard, as well as our esteemed audience and supporters. I look forward to seeing you next week. Have a lovely evening. Thank you.